Hey guys, this is Benny Ricciardi with rotocurve.com, and I'm here to bring you some college football thoughts for DFS on Saturday opening weekend. There's a couple guys that we're looking at up here. We're going to start with the quarterback position. The first guy we want to talk about is going to be Luke Falk. Luke Falk is the quarterback for Washington State. There's a few guys that you can pay up for on the day, but Falk is definitely my favorite. Last year, in the 4 games that he started after Connor Holiday went down, he averaged over 60 pass attempts per game. So if you have a guy who's going to be slinging it around that much, there's a good chance that he's going to rack up some yards and some touchdowns. He threw for 12 touchdowns and over 1,800 yards in those 4 games last year. So he's on pace basically to throw for about 400 yards and 3 touchdowns on average. If you can get that out of your quarterback, you're going to have a pretty big score. I like him. I don't know if I like his upside as much for tournaments. If you're looking to get a big score out of it altogether, he's probably going to wind up with a number somewhere in the 30s. Now, a number in the 30s is pretty good, but when you look at the price of him, about $10,000, it's probably not going to be enough to get you to the top of the tournament unless he has a huge game where he goes for 500 or 600 yards and 5 or 6 touchdowns. I don't know if I see that in his future, but I definitely think he's going to be a solid cash game option. And he does have one of the better matchups of all the guys up there at the high end of the price range. There's a couple guys in the middle range who I think are going to be very useful, whether you're using them for a tournament or for your cash games. 2 guys that I'm really looking at are Dane Evans from Tulsa and also Tommy Armstrong Jr. from Nebraska. Now, these are 2 different types of quarterbacks. The reason why I like Evans, his price is pretty cheap at only $6,700. And he's a guy who has 2 stud wide receivers on his team. Kevin Lucas, who we'll get to later, and also Kiaris Garrett. Both of these guys are big-time wide receivers. And even though Evans might not be a stud quarterback in every sense of the word, Heisman Trophy candidate kind of guy, he is going to be slinging it around to those 2 guys quite a bit, and he could put up a pretty big number at a pretty decent price. The other guy we talked about, Tommy Armstrong Jr., he's a completely different kind of quarterback. In college football DFS, we really like those guys who we consider to be dual threats. That means guys who can either throw the ball for 250, 300 yards, or guys who can use their legs and run for 100 yards. In different games last season, you got both the 300-yard bonus or the 100-yard rushing bonus out of a guy like Armstrong, which gives him a lot of upside. He can score touchdowns on the ground, and he can also score some through the air. I think he's going to be in a high-scoring game this weekend, and they're going to need him to do quite a bit if they're going to stay in it. So I think you could see 50 to 60 yards rushing out of him with a possible score, and also see him throw for over 200 yards and a score or 2 there as well. When you add all that up together at a $7,000 price tag, I think he's going to give you a really nice return on the day. If you're looking for a flyer, a really cheap option to include, I think you don't have to look any further than P.J. Walker from Temple. Walker is only $4,700. Now, again, I don't think this guy has huge upside. I'm not expecting 50 points out of him, and he is going up against a pretty tough Penn State defense. But he does run the ball, so he does get you a little bit of yardage that way, and he's also probably going to have to throw the ball quite a bit in order to keep them in this game. Now, he does have one of his top receivers back who was out all of last season, so I think there is a chance that he could wind up with 2 touchdowns here, maybe throw for 200 yards, rush for another 50, and give you a really nice overall score for only a $4,700 price tag. So of the quarterbacks that are there, those are some of the guys that I wanted to mention. Couple other guys that are in play. You can look at guys like Deshaun Watson. Another cheap option is a guy like Mark Leftwich, who's probably going to need to be throwing the ball because his team's going to be down quite a bit. He's only $4,200, so he could be another guy at the low end to look at. That BYU-Nebraska game should see a lot of points, so a guy like Taysom Hill is going to be in play. And if you're looking for another cheap option who has some upside, even though he disappointed quite a bit last season, I still think Matty Mock is a guy that you can look at. Again, he's more of a tournament option. He doesn't have a lot of safety, but he's another one of those guys that can throw the ball, that can run the ball, that could rack up some points pretty quick. And I think he might be a decent option leading this Mizzou offense. Now we're going to move on to running backs. There's quite a few running backs that are in play today. The first guy who I want to talk about, and the guy who's on the top of my list, is going to be Jordan Howard from Indiana. When Tevin Coleman went down last year, this is a guy who saw 25, 35 carries and put up some pretty decent numbers with him. I think if Indiana's going to have any chance to stay in this game this weekend, I think they're going to be ahead. I think they're going to be running the ball a lot, and I think that's going to mean we're going to see quite a bit of Howard. If you think about him as the guy who's taken over in the Tevin Coleman role, Tevin Coleman put up some huge numbers last year on that Indiana team. I'm not sure if Howard is quite that good, but if he's going to get the same kind of volume, he should still be able to put up some pretty big numbers. Next guy I want to talk about is somebody who DFS players used a lot last year. He's a little bit expensive, but you know he's gonna get a lot of carries and be a big part of that offense, and that's James Conner from Pittsburgh. The running back was pretty much one of the best players they had all last year. The other big-time player that they had is Tyler Boyd, the wide receiver. The problem with Boyd is he's going to be suspended for the first game, which only makes me think that they're going to be feeding Conner as often as they can. This is a guy who put up 30, 40 DraftKings points at different points in time last year, scores a bunch of touchdowns, has the ability to run for 150 to 200 yards, and he's going to get the opportunity with 25 to 30 carries probably. So if you're going to pay up for anybody at the running back position, I think he's probably the safest guy to get you a big number on a day, and will probably be somebody who I use in a lot of my rosters, especially in the cash games where you can afford to pay up for him. Another guy in that same kind of mold who's going to get a lot of carries, should rack up some yards and maybe get a touchdown, is Boston College running back John Hillman. Now, Hillman's a little bit cheaper. Obviously, I don't think he's as good a back as a guy like James Conner is, but if he's going to get his 20 carries in that BC running game, I think he's going to be able to put up some good points for you. At a medium price of only $6,900, I think you're going to get a lot of value for using a guy like Hillman in your roster, and it's also going to open you up to go get some of those bigger ticket guys that you want to put into your roster as well. On the cheap end, I do think that a guy like Akeel Lynch from Penn State is in a good spot here. I think Penn State is going to be winning this game against Temple, meaning they're probably going to be keeping the ball on the ground a lot in the second half. I'm not a big fan of guys like Deshaun Hamilton and Christian Hackenberg this week. I think it's probably going to be more with the run game for Penn State. And when you look at the run game, you got to look at a guy like Lynch. Now, Lynch is very cheap at only $4,600. So the reason I like him is I expect him to get big volume, and I also expect him to score some touchdowns. But I also like the fact that at that cheap price, he doesn't need to do a ton in order to pay it off. If he does get you 100 yards rushing and a touchdown, he's going to wind up with at least 20 points on the day. And that would be a pretty good return for a guy who's only $4,600. There's a bunch of other running backs that we want to consider. I think you can look at a guy like Nick Chubb, although I'm a little bit concerned that game is going to turn into a big blowout, so I don't know how much work he's going to get. Guys like Brandon Ross and Justin Jackson are pretty good salary savers. I like both of them. Paul Perkins is a little bit expensive from UCLA, but he's going to be a big part of that offense, especially with the freshman quarterback back there. Russell Hansborough and Alex Collins. Those are the guys who I'm looking at right now at the moment. But again, I like them all a little bit less than the guys who we mentioned up top as the top four. Moving on to wide receiver, there's a ton of wide receiver options that we could look at. First guy I want to mention is that guy I mentioned before, and that's Kevon Lucas. Now, this is a guy who had double-digit catches in a bunch of games last year, had 100 yards, had some touchdowns. I mean, he basically did it all. He finished with 101 catches for over 1,200 yards and 11 touchdowns last season. And he's a guy who's been able to put up some big numbers. He had some 30 and 40-point games last year. And I think against an overmatched Florida Atlantic team, I think that they're going to be throwing the ball often. And I think that Lucas is going to be able to put up a big number. His price is $7,800, so it's not too overly expensive. But he is going to need a big game in order to pay that off. But a guy who can get you a lot of catches in a PPR format, also rack up some yards and get you touchdowns, is the kind of guy who can pay off a big price like that. Next guy I want to talk about is Gabe Marks from Washington State. Now, River Craycraft is the guy that everybody knows from Washington State and is probably going to be the guy who's the big option that everybody takes. Now, Craycraft's very expensive, almost $8,000. Marks is a guy who's only about $6,000. He's going to be taking over the Vincent Mail role in that offense. And if we remember from last year, he was a guy who was able to catch 6 to 10 balls a game, had a couple 100-yard receiving games, picked up a couple touchdowns. So if you got a guy who's going to be playing in that role that's only $6,000 on a team that's going to throw the ball probably 50 to 70 times on Saturday, I think you're going to be able to get some good production out of him. At 6,200, you also only need about 25 to 30 points to really have him pay off his salary. And I think that he's going to be somebody who can do that if he does get that 6 to 8 catches and a 100-yard bonus to go along with it. Next guy I want to talk about is somebody who has more talent than possibly anybody else and plays on a team that has such a horrible defense that you pretty much are guaranteed they're going to be throwing the ball. And that's Roger Lewis from Bowling Green. Now, this guy had some huge games last year. He had 16 catches one game against Indiana with a couple touchdowns and a ton of yards. He had some other games towards the end of the season where he was getting double covered and only wound up with 3 or 4 catches for a lot of yards. I think Bowling Green is going to have to throw the ball a lot in order to stay into this game. His price is pretty generous at only $5,700. And remember, this is a guy that was getting recruited by a lot of the big schools, had some off-the-field issues that basically cost him to lose the scholarship that he did have. And that's how we wound up at Bowling Green. But he has, NFL-type talent, NFL-type upside. So I think that he's a guy who could have a big game for you at a pretty square price of only 5,700. Couple other guys on the cheap end who I think you might want to look at. There's a guy named Kieran Priester on that Washington State team. He's a transfer coming in from Clemson. Dom Williams was a guy that they were expecting at Washington State to really step up and be a playmaker for him this year. And it feels like Priester has taken over the slot duties from Dom Williams. Williams will still get in there because this Washington State team does run a lot of 4 and 5 receiver sets. But Priester is minimum value, only $3,000 over on DraftKings. You don't need him to do a bunch to pay off his salary, and he's a guy who they've been raving about how well he's been playing in spring practice, and even in the summer before the season started. I think he's somebody who could get you 5 or 6 catches for 50 or 60 yards and a touchdown, which doesn't sound like a ton, but that would give you somewhere between 16 and 20 DraftKings points, and a guy that you can get at minimum salary that's going to get you 16 to 20 DraftKings points is going to be returning good value, and also is going to allow you to go up and pay for some big studs at other positions that you might want to put in there. Last guy I want to talk about, big wide receiver from BYU. As we said, that BYU-Nebraska game should be turning into a shootout, and BYU has a 6'6" receiver in Mitch Matthews, who's a guy who can go up and get the ball. Big red zone target, somebody who's definitely a threat to get more than 1 touchdown pass on the game. You know that Taysom Hill is going to be throwing the ball. You know that BYU offense is going to try to put some points up on the board, and I think that you're going to see a lot of Matthews in there. He didn't have a ton of catches last year, but he did have a lot of catches for long yardage. They throw the ball deep to him. He uses his big frame to get position and come down with it. So I think he's a guy that I'm going to be looking at. If he can get you 4 or 5 catches, 100 yards, and maybe a touchdown or 2, he's going to return great value for you at a price of only $6,700. A couple other honorable mention receivers, a guy like Jakeem Grant from Texas Tech. That Texas Tech team likes to throw the ball around, so Grant could have a big game here on Saturday. Guys like Mike Williams and Dom Williams are also going to be in play for their respective teams. A guy who is a great PPR guy, Rashawn Caesar from University of Louisiana Monroe. He's definitely somebody who you should look at. He had 8 to 12 catches in most of his games last year. And again, in a PPR site, if you can get a guy like that for pretty cheap, I think he's only $4,100 today. He does have a very tough matchup, so I'm not saying he's a great stud automatic kind of play. But if he's a guy that can catch you 8 to 10 balls, even if he catches 8 to 10 balls for 60 or 70 yards, he's still going to wind up with a pretty good score, especially at a cheap price. He's going to give you good value. Another guy you can look at, Amba Ete Tawo from Maryland. I'm not sure if I'm even saying that name right, but basically Maryland had a mass exodus. A whole bunch of their receivers, whole bunch of their players on that offense just wound up packing up and leaving, transferring to other schools, graduation. So they lost a whole bunch of the guys last year who were their pass catchers. 2 years ago, Taiwo was pretty good, and this year he's now their number 1 receiver with everybody else that left. So he's still pretty cheap as well. I think Maryland is going to be behind in that game, so they're going to need to pass. And I think he could be somebody that gets you some good value as a cheap option, who's somebody who's going to see, basically a lot more targets than he has last year. Last couple guys I want to mention, Robbie Anderson from Temple. He was their big wide receiver 2 years ago, had to sit out all last year. So like I said, I'm a big fan of PJ Walker, and if you're going to take a PJ Walker, you can put him together with a minimum price guy like Robert Anderson. And with those 2 guys locked up on your roster, you'll basically have enough money to go up and get whatever studs you want and fit them in there. And you can have, if the 2 of them have a good day and you get all those studs to play really well, you could have a really big roster on the day if you use these 2 guys and they're able to hook up for a touchdown or 2. Last guy I want to talk about, Devin Lauderdale. He's another guy with some big play potential. Had some big games towards the end of last season, and I'm expecting him to carry it over into this season. So that pretty much sums it up for us on all the guys that we're looking at for college football. Obviously, make sure you guys check on the injury reports. Make sure you see, come game day, who might not be in there, where you can find some value. Again, with the spreads not being out yet, I'm kind of guessing on which games I think are going to be blowouts or not. If we get a couple surprises on that end by Saturday, there may be some other guys who I didn't consider here that we might have to put back into play. But basically, like I said, with the way everything's looking and with the early spreads that are out, these are the guys who stand out the most to me and are going to be the backbone of most of my teams on Saturday. So college football season is here, which means NFL season is coming up next week. I hope you guys are getting excited for the NFL football and college football content we're going to be bringing you here on RotoCurve. Make sure you check back daily as we're putting articles up throughout the season. I'm going to be handling a lot of the stuff on the DraftKings side. Josh is going to be handling a lot of stuff on the FanDuel side. And as always, we're going to have the legend Mike Rathburn coming and giving his fantasy football advice, whether it be college football or NFL, and, kind of tying it all together. So thank you for joining us over here at RotoCurve. And as always, stay classy, DFS.